Good morning. We are delighted to kick off this fifth and final day of Safety Week, focused on privacy and safety today, and we're delighted that you could join us. So I'm looking forward to, and have been for as long as we've been talking about this discussion with two friends and collaborators, Tom Campbell, with whom I have another article coming out shortly, and an expert in all things future and trends, especially national security and intelligence matters, and Damien Weldon, who is a true expert in all things risk identification and management, especially in financial services. They will more elaborately introduce themselves in a moment. But we're looking forward to having you as part of this Gremlins and Guardrails discussion as well. So we'll be monitoring the chat as much as we can and reserving time at the end to take live questions. As I said, I'll have Tom and Damien introduce themselves further too and tell you a little bit more about their work to get us kicked off. For my part, I'm Karen Silverman, founder of the Cantellus group. We're an advisory group that helps corporate and public sector leaders on the why and how of AI and frontier technology governance. And we treat it really as a strategic function, and that's how we think about it, involving ethics and compliance, but going beyond that as well. So helping clients take the next useful step on their responsible AI journey and see around some corners. With that, Tom, why don't you, well, I should mention that my background is as a lawyer. So that's sort of what I bring to this discussion in addition to the business advisory piece. Was a partner for several decades at Latham and for a time at the U.S. Department of Justice. Now, Tom, why don't you tell us briefly about yourself and then we'll kick things off.
So thanks, Karen, for the great introduction. It's a thrill to be with you and Damien here today to talk about XR Safety Week. And so I have a bit of a crazy eclectic background. I'm Tom Campbell. I'm the founder and CEO of an advisory group called FutureGrasp. You can see my little logo in the screen there. This is an advisory group which is comprised of several other former senior US government officials like myself. We're dedicated to identifying and assessing emerging tech and its geopolitical, national security, and economic implications. So as a group, we work with IGOs, governments, corporate startups, and investors around the world. Prior to forming FutureGrasp about 4 years ago, I was the first National Intelligence Officer for Technology with the US National Intelligence Council in the Office of Director of National Intelligence. And as NIO Tech, I was the senior most analyst in the IC or intelligence community on emerging and civil technologies for roughly 3 years at the tail end of the Obama administration. I departed in late or mid 2017 or so. So I'm also currently a senior fellow with the Council on Competitiveness, which is a leading think tank in Washington, DC, as well as a special advisor to Bootstrap Labs, which is a leading venture capital firm in Silicon Valley, California. And in addition to these roles, I have extensive other prior experience in government, academia, investments, and industry, both nationally and internationally. I've lived overseas in Europe a couple of years, done a lot of interesting things, fun times. I hold a PhD in aerospace engineering sciences from the University of Colorado Boulder, where I am right now in Colorado, and a BE in mechanical engineering from Vanderbilt University. So I'm happy to have Damien move on. And so that's a lot of information, but happy to have talk with others later on about my background if they're interested.
Great. Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you, Karen, for setting us up and the wonderful introduction. It's a real pleasure and honor indeed to be part of Safety Week at such a prescient time in the development of the metaverse and extended reality more generally. My name is Damien Weldon. I'm at the Molybdenum here in San Francisco, California. My background is as a quantitative analyst, so as a data scientist and analyst, more specifically in financial services, and more specifically within the areas of risk management that encompasses a very, very wide spectrum of risk, principally things like credit risk, in finance and in debt, ranging all the way over to privacy and compliance on the operational side also. I've had a wide variety of roles in my background, from data scientist, product management, also business and corporate development also, and delighted to be part of the team today and looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Well, thank you guys. Among us and between us, we have so many different perspectives, and I think that's part of what we're going to try to elicit here, right? Is a discussion about some very imminent metaverse topics, but from all these different perspectives and with all these different lived experiences. So we picked this topic, Gremlins and Guardrails, because it really signifies where we are with the metaverse right now. We know that it will introduce new sort of wonderful things and mind-blowing advances. it's also going to introduce new forms of disaster and challenge. And we know that we need to start thinking now about how we're going to manage those risks in order to mitigate them. So starting with you, Tom, I'd like to hear from both of you about where you expect the metaverse to sit within your world, whether that's your work world or your play world. You know, where are you going to encounter it? What are you expecting from it as you think about things?
Well, that's a very great broad question, and it depends how you define worlds, I guess. I mean, we all kind of live in our virtual worlds. We live in the in-person worlds, although that's been somewhat dampened with the pandemic and so forth. We're trying to get back at it. But overall, XR technology is evolving really fast. So we all have these highly capable VR systems, Oculus Quest, Sony PlayStation, Vive, Cosmos, et cetera, which are fortunately becoming more affordable today. There are also substantial AR systems, such as the Microsoft HoloLens, which my former world, the government, US government's actually using it for military training now. One of the interesting quotes that Karen and I put in the article that she alluded to earlier is, per the Wash Post, global spending on AR and VR is expected to jump more than six-fold to $72 billion in 2024 from about $12 billion just last year in 2020, as more companies adopt the tech following the pandemic. This is not a surprise considering how much of a virtual world we all live in. Use cases run the gamut, current and potential social activities. In VR, gaming is especially prominent for a wide swath of applications. And the ability to immerse oneself with a customized avatar has been embraced by millions of players, but that's been going on for several years. But I believe that tech is really advanced a lot, even in the last 2 years with the gaming capability. You have omnidirectional treadmills. You can walk within the virtual environment. I've seen that. Several years ago back at the CES show in Las Vegas, I had these people walking around with their treadmills in the VR world, almost like Ready Player One, the game, the book and movie series. In AR, the fusion of reality and digital enhancements opens up new opportunities. And we can see, for example, the capability, if you have an advanced AR system, and you're visiting a new city, you might be able to use that digital information overlays in the augmented reality to provide perhaps historical context. So the town I live in is rather small, and you can walk around and say, oh, that got built 100 years ago, or find that perfect restaurant faster.
So so gaming and information is really what you're describing right now.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to bring Damien in on this too. What is this going to change your work life? Like, how do you see it coming up?
I do think it will change all our work lives. The question is over what time frame and over what type of adoption curve. And again, like the standard hype cycle, we've all seen that curve in technology adoption. The question is, will the metaverse fit that curve, or does it have a set of unique and very idiosyncratic characteristics that means that its adoption, whether in a particular business or industry vertical or the consumer space more generally from a commerce standpoint, is different from what we've seen before. Tom quite rightly uses the word fusion there, and I think there's still a little bit of an open debate. Is this, in classic Venn diagrams terms, is this the union of the real world and the virtual world, or is it actually the intersection? And no matter what it is, I think certainly from a commerce standpoint, in terms of enterprise deployments, typically a new plethora, plenum like this is going to be looked at from both an offense and defense standpoint. So from an offense standpoint, what are the business opportunities? What are the ways to engage customers of all kinds between providers, say financial services, or other types of business services, consumers? What are the businesses? What's the nature of that new intimacy that will come about through XR? And then from a defense standpoint, what are the risks, both in terms of an extension, no pun intended, of existing risks and the creation of new risks through the use of this space. So I think, and privacy obviously is something that's very, very central to that. But more specifically, if we really drill and root into that, I think the area of identity management, with the classic, how you say who you are, are you who you appear to be? So the question of authenticity, the question of identity, the question of truth, right, is right at the kernel of this entire space. So we definitely envisage new tools, solutions, platforms for being able to, ensure that there is a true, path of authenticity, identification, all of those things that really make for trust, right? Because ultimately, trust is in play here, as it is in any virtual space, but the more so given the particular characteristics of XOR. So, what are the new grounds for trust intelligence, right? The new ways of validating that, verifying that, giving participants, whether businesses, government, consumers, citizens, whatever their role, and indeed multiple roles may be, a sense of safety, which is exactly obviously what our talk and our week is about this. So, and when you dig into that from an operational standpoint, clearly the use of data and how data is managed, harvested, collected, stored is right at the heart of this. And one of the biggest drivers of that is going to be data explosion. Right now, the body and the physical shape and whatnot is going to be in play here, right? So we're not just looking at someone's name, someone's social security number, someone's address, right? You've also got literally their physical characteristics are all in play. That's billions and billions of data points every minute of activity here, all of which can be used to infer, or some at least of which can be used to infer identity and hence the privacy in play. So in a nutshell, Karen, data and the whole explosion of data and the management of data is going to be central to this going forward, certainly in my mind.
No, and I think, and from our world, it's going to be very much that suite of trust and integrity issues and authenticity issues, as well as, how we protect, but then enforce rights, whether those are contractual rights or civil rights, that it really becomes really unclear and really murky who has jurisdiction, who has authorities, who can contract for you, and what it means to assign risk between parties in a virtual world is going to be a very different thing. And that's a byproduct of a lot of these identity and authenticity questions that I think you're raising. Tom, I'd like to hear from you, I guess, a little bit about what, because people are asking how and why is the metaverse different from Web 2.0, for instance, or these very sophisticated technologies. As you said, you alluded to the fact that we're already pretty immersed in our virtual worlds in a flat way.
Yeah.
But it's not just adding a third dimension that's going to happen, right? It's not just better graphics. Can you explain, sort of from your perspective, how the metaverse really differs and departs and challenges us in new ways?
Yeah. Well, I think you're spot on, Karen, and to augment Damien's excellent comments too. The metaverse I see is we're almost going, and it's kind of ironic we're calling it Web 3.0 because it is now becoming three-dimensional. So, and even more importantly, immersive. And that feeds a whole onslaught of new data sets. I was just reading this morning on Twitter that people in the government are actually getting worked up about, well, what if you have a pulse detector or an oxygen sensor on your gear, your rig, that can be then tracked. So you're getting into physiological data about yourself, your heart rate, your stress cortisone levels, these sorts of things, what could be potentially monitored in a very immersive world. And I should also augment Damien's great comments. There's a strong decentralization theme. The metaverse isn't just VR and XR. It also goes into this weird sort of strange world, which we're all sort of trying to figure out. And I think even the folks in the Bay Area, from what I've seen, are trying to figure it out, of cryptocurrencies, blockchains, non-fungible tokens, NFTs, and these decentralized autonomous organizations as DAOs. Last week, there was a group, a DAO group that got stood up, which was trying to buy the Constitution, the US Constitution. They had a NFT of it, and it was being auctioned. Some group was auctioning it, and this DAO raised something like $20–30 million to try and buy it. They got overbid by somebody else, but that's like the US Constitution, so as an NFT. And so these are becoming very interesting worlds. I was watching The Economist had a great summary of 2021 yesterday online. You can watch it if you're a subscriber, but they were saying that they had an NFT that they put out on one of their cover pages. It was the rabbit hole of crypto cover page, and they did not expect it to sell. Guess what? They sold that NFT for $440,000 of Ethereum equivalent. And that they were shocked, and they gave the money to charity and everything. But admittedly, it's a strange new world in finance, in entertainment, in banking, and all these things. I honestly believe it's going to cut across all of society at some level.
Yeah, I mean, it almost has to. But Damien, yeah, I was going to ask you. I mean, you're in the risk and financial services. Like, how do you start thinking about integrity of product and value and what's fraud and what's invention, right? I mean, how do we?
Yeah, and listening to Tom there, I was reminded of the idea of sovereignty, right? Yeah. And in particular, the sovereignty of the human subject as a citizen, as a business, whatever roles we're adopting and portraying in society. But sovereignty is very, in the classical sense, is very much a singular entity, right? What we're looking at here, whether we call it decentralization or democratization, or there's a whole set of words associated with it, it effectively, whether you use the word fragmentation, but you certainly it's at least a fractionalization, right? And a singularity is now almost like a continuous function in that terms, and it's distributed. So the question then is, where does action, authority lie? Because obviously that's, for example, coming back to the comments you were making earlier, Karen, in relation to the concept of harm in law, the concept of remedy, right? Where is the two sides of the action here if you have that type of distribution? So I think what we're doing here in our conversation so far is very much laying out what the tapestry, the spectrum of all of this is, in terms to moving to solutions and frameworks and a way of corralling all of this, so that people feel involved or have a sense of agency and participation in this. It really behooves, we often use the words whole of government or whole of society. This is almost, dare I say it, whole of universe, right? Everybody has to have a voice in this, and whether it's true, agencies like the United Nations or other supranational bodies, trading blocs like the EU or whatever, whoever it may be, everybody really needs to come to the table on this at this very early stage, so that we're not in catch-up mode and trying to address harms and misfeasance, misinformation, and some of the more egregious things that have happened in the internet over the last several decades, before it's too late. We actually bake in some of these frameworks and protections and industry standards, whatever they may be, at this early stage while the clay is still wet.
Yeah. And I think this by design idea is pretty important, right? That this is not these safety, when we get to the guardrails part, bolting them on afterwards is going to be, better than not, but not effective.
Yeah. One of my worries is the government where I used to reside. I'm not certain that they're really on top of this. I mean, there might be subgroups and sub-agencies I'm not aware of that are tracking this, and I encourage them to reach out to us and all the participants in this XR Safety Week, because it's super important. We don't just let this flow away and then, oh, shucks, now 5 years later, we have all these issues, Meta, Facebook, and other things that can really undermine our society, dangers about cybersecurity, national security, other types of areas, which hadn't been thought of before. And that's one reason I work with great folks like Karen and Damien, is to try and suss these things out a little bit in advance.
I mean, it's
I think business has
no, go ahead, Damien.
Thanks, Karen. I think business and commerce has a huge role to play in this, and the private sector, private industry more generally, and in the domain in which I work, financial services more so, and we already see these nascent signs of what one may term mainstream financial services organizations, tipping the toe in crypto, blockchain, and so on. Again, at a certain pace, and again, regulators have been looking at this, and the DC world also. But but as we know, currency, crypto, blockchain, and so on is just really one layer within this much broader, much vaster, extended reality space. And I think it's important that the space is looked at in its totality as a nexus of all sorts of consumer service provider, interactions, and then what are the associated risks and mitigations of those, from a safety and soundness standpoint, which is very much something that underlies, for example, the banking system in the world. You look at those risks explicitly, and you look at the frameworks and the risk management of that in order to ensure members of the public, citizens, consumers, that yes, this is your commerce and your transaction is safe here, and that what a provider knows about you is only what they need to know and no more.
Yeah, and in addition to finance in the banking world, just even the ability to go in and feel comfortable in a game, in an entertainment scenario, and so forth. And what Facebook is doing and so forth is the keynote by Zuckerberg was very visionary. Most of the tech that he displayed in that keynote is not possible to do and leverage right now. But if it could be, and it will be eventually, but I believe, especially if they're investing $10 billion, I think, in the next year or so, and just in virtual reality, then what does that mean? I mean, are we going to feel comfortable going into these worlds where almost every physical action, every little facial tick, every eyebrow glance can be tracked? That's a big question in my mind, and I'm not sure it's an answerable question right now.
Well, and there's it's not an answerable question, and I don't think it's a binary question, right? Yeah. And I think that's one of the limitations right now of some of the proposed, if not regulations, but when we think about guardrails, there's a very much sort of an off-on switch, and I think we need a dimmer, right? I mean, you need people, there needs to be a way to experiment and play and find out where you would, as a consumer, understand the value equation to be, right? And how does the provider on the one hand offer a product, and how does the consumer on the other hand engage with that product in sort of an experimental way that doesn't start to, or go immediately to some exploitive place, right?
Yeah.
And how do we think about, I mean, one of the questions we ask in the piece, Tom, is, we tend to think about regulation and safety as, there's the population, and then there are vulnerable populations within and around that. Typically we look at youth or cognitively impaired, or what, I mean, we look at vulnerability as a sorting exercise in a way. And I think one of the questions that the metaverse raises is, are we all a vulnerable population? Yeah. And do we need to be thinking about safety in a fundamentally different way as a result, right? Because these technologies are designed to reach us where we are best and where we are worst, right? And how do we manage that what does safety mean in that context?
Yeah, one of my greatest fears is that all the filter bubbles we have in normal social media right now will just morph right over into XR. It's almost inevitable. I mean, I think it's human nature to try and stay within the groups in which we're comfortable and so forth, unfortunately. But it's that will be manifested even more prominently and even more perhaps filterized in the XR environments, because there's so many controls you'll be able to have in the XR environment compared to what do you have on the flat 2D screen. And I'm sure Damien could augment that comment too.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, Tom, of that classic piece by Samuel Martin Lipset, one of those classics of political science many, many decades ago, where he opens his work saying, humankind is cooperative, but also competitive, right?
Yeah.
And, whether you come at that from an anthropological standpoint or, virtual reality, extended reality, whatever it is, I think we all know that, yes, that's a little, Tweedledum and Tweedledee of our existence. The role of government, the role of enterprise, the role of any organizational construct in that is to enable and to foster both of those, right? Yeah. The competitive piece to drive innovation, to solve problems, the cooperative piece to ensure participation and non-exclusion, right? Mm-hmm. And even to your point, Tom, around, even if we think of things like the ADA, right, where, so the use of current, web-based software, whether from a color standpoint or using the keyboard, someone with a particular set of disabilities has to be catered for in that. For example, if you're engaging with the US federal government, what does that mean in the metaverse where someone can't raise their arm because they have an infirmity, right? And what, or vision impairment and so on. So we all come with a set of amazing bodies, but also limited bodies, right? Mm-hmm. So what does that mean in terms of our access to full participation in the metaverse, and as well as the safety net and the supports and indeed the remedies if they transpire not to be actuated. And I have a question for Karen in that regard. Are we seeing, insight and focus in the legal community more generally around these topics, or is it still at a very nascent stage?
You're on mute, Karen. Karen, you're on mute.
I said I'm gonna go with nascent, because I think we're still at the mind's blown stage, right? where people are trying, and it's interesting because there is a cohort within the legal community that is very forward thinking and policy focused and anticipatory. The business of law, though, and the way that laws, both legislative and statutory, as well as common law, which is sort of how we actually get most of what we get done in the court system and in the judiciary. And by the way, a lot of law never touches courts, right? It's just how we arrange our commercial lives. But and most of that is an applied science. It's what happens when something falls on the ground and we observe the consequences of it, and then that gets worked out through rules and evidence and remedies, right? And so it's very backward looking. It's very after the fact. It's very contextual, and that is almost the diametric opposition, or alternative to this sort of policy oriented, forward thinking, by design characteristic that we've been describing. And so how that gets worked out is really going to be an interesting question. I mean, we still haven't figured that out, for instance, around obviously, famously, content moderation on the internet, right? I mean, we're still dealing with 20, 25-year-old problems in the law, some of those solutions will read on to the metaverse, but the newest and most novel won't, right? And so we need to, this is one of those areas where I think we need to start thinking more differently than we have. And it doesn't mean that we have to turn the court systems upside down, but we need to really think about the metaverse differently than we would think about the real world or the analog world, or however we want to refer to whatever it is we have now.
Do you see either an opportunity or a risk for different jurisdictions, whether the EU, the US, China, other domains and blocks, to have differential advantage in terms of enabling a particular regulatory framework or legislative framework for the metaverse in their jurisdictions, which or do you see this as being a true global, rising tide lifting all boats type of paradigm?
Some of it will be global, and it's certainly of global consequence. I think the concern, and this is where the concerns pretty well align with Tom's world and the geopolitical worries, that we're moving into a sort of a broad regional fracturing and that those regions will compete with each other on different dimensions and aspects, right? So if you're looking, I mean, I don't know if this is how, but for instance, Europe is very forward on the human centricity and rights grounding, right, for their regulation. If that's the kind of safety in the environment that you want to participate in, that sort of regime will be a place where you would be more comfortable. If you are more tending towards the, roguish, let's see how far we can take this, there may be other regions and other systems that are more accommodating to that way of thinking. And I think that you're going to start seeing competition between those, and that's really going to be the challenge for global mediation, is to how do you keep that competition in check
and reduce the arbitrage, or minimizing it at least.
And if I might jump in, one comment that Karen and I make the point of passingly in the article we have coming out in the AI Journal, it's going to actually be a report, is about the so-called splinternet. And so just this morning, I saw that Baidu is standing up its own metaverse. So there's already the great firewall, they call it, within China, in which they block all the major fangas, their Facebook, Apple's, Netflix, Google's, Amazon's, et cetera, et cetera. And so they are basically going to mimic almost everything we do in the West, but internal to China. And so for the last 20 years, there has been a splinterization, AKA the splinter net of the internet, in which there is this walling up of the various languages, accessibilities, and then just basically even the pipes that go into the countries are being blocked from certain countries. That will become manifested even more so in the metaverse. And that's honestly, from a personal perspective, I see that as very sad because we won't be able to engage with some countries in the metaverse at all. Not just from a transport your avatar from one platform to another, but you will not be allowed to go into that other platform, period. And so that's a big concern from a geopolitical perspective. Those communication lines then break down even more. So if we eventually get to the point of having whole conferences in the metaverse, and there's been XR Safety Week is doing this XR right now, but if it's truly a global scene in which you have 50, 100, 200 countries involved, or 190 countries involved, you may not be able to do it. I mean, it'd be physically impossible to do that. So that is honestly, from my perspective, a sad thing, but it's something that will occur. I forecast at least.
Yeah.
So Tom, it's really almost what you're pointing to there is that emulation or replication effect. Here's some of the things that are happening now, and we're just going to carry all those bad old things over to the metaverse. And then one thinks of could there be a private or a set of private metaverses? Could there be a dark metaverse in the same way that there's a dark web for all sorts of misfeasance and criminal activity, and that's what we don't want, right?
Yeah, and like in Ready Player 1 and 2, there's the Oasis, they call it, in which everybody in the globe is in one platform. That's not going to happen in the real world. It's just not. I mean, we're already seeing this breakdown in all the different organizations want to put their strong foot stomp on their own platform so that all the ads and all the money can flow to them. As much as Facebook, and now Meta, for example, says, oh, we were going to be platform agnostic. I'm not so sure. We'll see how it all rolls, but I'm a bit of a skeptic that'll actually occur.
So I can't be on a panel where we don't eventually turn it to like, what are we going to do? Like, what kind of advice are we giving our clients? And sitting here today, given all the things that we don't know and we can't know, but we can start to anticipate. I mean, every one of us is frankly, paid to scan the horizon and see past it a little bit. What kind of advice are you giving your clients, whether they're governments or corporates, about the impact of the metaverse and what they can be doing now to start thinking about those guardrail thinking?
Yeah, Damien, why don't you go first? Because I've got my own comments.
Sure. So I think with any, whether you regard XR and metaverse as a frontier technology, but certainly from an enterprise standpoint, it has that characteristic. And if you look, for example, at another area where Tom and I do a lot of work, quantum computing, and it's really only in the last 12 to 18 months that major corporations, particularly in the financial services area, are now looking at this, right? So, but looking at that, for example, over a 3-5 year horizon. So I think for most folks, the advice is education, knowledge, and some responsibility. And what I mean by that is that and because of the nature of this technology, it's a little bit akin to certainly from in commerce and from an enterprise standpoint, folks appointed chief digital officers and digital teams over the last, say, 5 to 7 years. I think that's the sort of cadre and cohort that the Fortune 500 will start to look at for this. Initially, appoint person or persons to do briefing, and obviously part of our world and our job with this team is to assist in that. And then, what does it mean for their businesses, for their enterprises, and most importantly, for the customers? So there's an education piece. And then I think the second piece is really, the voice of participants as stakeholders. And then, through XR Safety Week and other similar bodies, arranging those roundtables, industry forums, whatever they may be, so that, people can actually give voice to both their concerns and their opportunities. There's a corralling of that, an inventory of those, and then ultimately that leads as a seedbed for policy and hence, industry-driven regulation and legislative proposals, and that on a global, transnational basis. So I think that's the apex right at the top of the pyramid right now in terms of working with clients and industry more generally.
I wanted Damien to go first because I figured he would hit up several of the points, so I don't have to be redundant. But so thanks for that, Damien. So Karen and I, in the AI Journal piece, we describe a 10-point action plan for prepping industry and government for the metaverse. I won't go through all 10 points. You can read it when it comes out, perhaps in the next couple of days. But there's a couple of highlights I would want to augment Damien's excellent comments. One of the things is that XR, we have to recognize it is different. And so one of the things, whether it's in law or in regulation or in business, a lot of times people say, oh, well, it's just the same old thing. No, this is actually relatively different. And the lines of accountability, different perspectives, the guardrails that we have an allusion to in our title, safety, security, boundaries, cyber, we need to bake these in. And this is a constant drumbeat. I've been in emerging tech for like 20 years, and cybersecurity, oh, we'll bake that in once we get sued. It's kind of the attitude of some companies, sadly. And that's most unfortunate if you're going to take that attitude in the metaverse, because there might be a lot of litigation coming down. Governance issues. So I urge my colleagues in the government, if anybody's watching from the government, consider starting to think about regulations in this space. It's not too late. In fact, in some ways, if we don't do it now, then it may be too late even in the next few months, because things are going to move so fast. We need to engage C-suite. So Damien was telling us the other day, he's heard rumblings about chief metaverse officer. I'm not sure how that'll be confused with chief marketing officer from a CMO perspective, but we need companies, especially large companies, need to think about how they're going to position themselves in the metaverse. So I understand the fashion community, for example, is going whole hog. Gucci has its own metaverse team almost, I understand, in which they're investing in this space because they recognize, hey, we can sell digital handbags or digital things at perhaps a price point that may benefit us in addition to the physical handbags. Communicate with customers. And lastly, most not least, and these are Karen's words in our article, and I love this last point, be willing to take a breath, leap in thoughtfully, and be prepared for lots of surprises. We don't know where all this is going to go yet. It's going to be a wild ride. It has, even for the folks who've been tracking this field even the last year or so, but it's going to shake out, and there will be instantiations and things we like and things we don't like, but we need to embrace it and get involved now as opposed to later. So,
yeah. Well, and that's a great handoff, because I think that adding on to both of your really excellent points, I would say that the mindset too has to be one of learning and journey, right? This is not sometimes I'm asked sort of, how do we solve this problem? And I don't think solving is what we do. I think improving is what we do in this space, because it's always going to be a new problem and a new thing. And so thinking about this as a work in progress always, as opposed to someplace you need to arrive, is really important, because it's sort of freeing, right? There's not one way to do this. There's not one best way to do it, but continuing also, I agree, we'll need some regulation around some things, but really involving stakeholders, whether that's corporates or consumers, in that conversation, I think is important, because we're going to need agility around that, right? That if and we're finding that now in the communication space, is that rules and regulations that were developed in the mid-90s are completely unhelpful now, but somehow they're still warping and impacting how we're doing telecom, right? And we're spending a lot of time and effort arguing about how to apply mid-90s rules to 2021 problems, where we could really just be focusing on the 2021 problems. So how do we create governance models that may include regulation, but really, really reward kind of that by design thinking and not just self-regulation, but internalization of the guardrails thinking, and setting up an environment where that discussion is happening in a much more robust and flexible way. So that is a bit of a future state, but I think we can already be thinking about what we would want to see in that kind of a world, right? That is regulated. We want to see a level playing field. We want to see opportunities for experimentation and discussion. We want to see, how we could start thinking about how the characteristics of that engagement with our customers, with our regulators, with other governments, right? I mean, depending on our perspective. So there's a lot of that forethought, and that nests, I think, pretty neatly with the strategic functions in most organizations, right? And so we need to sort of understand that there's a huge compliance piece to this, obviously, and once there are rules, we all need to figure out what those mean to us. But there's really a preceding strategic moment too, and I think that's where we are right now, is more in that space than we are in the compliance space. So, you know, lifting our gaze a little bit maybe is the way I would summarize that. I know that if you're on Zoom, we can take questions in the chat if anybody wants to send questions in. I know that each of us and all of us are happy to take questions offline. If you want to reach out to us via LinkedIn or any other way, we're happy to continue this conversation. It's one that we have even when we're not being filmed. Can we still say filmed? I don't know, but even when we're not being recorded. Yeah, this is a conversation.
Taped. I like the word taped. Go back to the really old 80s days. So,
so in wrapping this up, because I know we want to do that. And this is an impossible question, but 3 to 5 years from now, what will the topic of this panel be? Like, what will we be focused on? If you can tell.
If I can jump in on this one first, Damien, because so my company, FutureGrasp, we try and look 3 to 5 years and even up to 20 years out for various clients in this context. And so there's a couple points I just want to highlight just from my own perception. So predictions are impossible in tech. So I'm not going to speak about specific companies or specific areas, but trends are something that we try and assess. So off the top, cybersecurity attacks will accelerate in the metaverse. I'm sad to say that. So great folks like Damien and many others watch cybersecurity very carefully. Guarantee will accelerate. The froth in crypto and NFT markets will continue, but they may ultimately become more stable as the financials world gears up to adopt, and as well as perhaps governments regulate them. So there is traction in both these contexts right now. I also would suggest that XR platforms will be increasingly adopted by the big platforms. So your Meta, Google, Apple, Amazon, et cetera. And we as consumers of all these free products will be forced even more so to use them. So advertising will be a major drive in the metaverse. So I think advertisers, once they see the amount of money you can make as you track every single facial recognition, every little glance, every little look at a product, they're going to suggest and see huge profit potential. And also gaming in itself will become even more sophisticated and a bigger industry and perhaps even more immersive as we go into these spaces. So those are my high level thoughts. I'm sure there's more. I may be wrong. I'm frequently wrong about trying to even forecast trends, but those are sorts of things that I see within the community from where I sit. And I'm sure Damien has some other excellent comments as well for to augment.
Yeah, Tom, thank you for the, let's all resume in 5 years' time, this day at this time, and check in with ourselves on that. But no, I agree with your comments on that. I think one of the unintended ironies of the metaverse is there's almost a slightly retro feature to it. And what I mean by that is that we've been so used to over the last several decades looking at our screens, interacting as we are with each other right now in a 2D paradigm, right? In the metaverse, that is now an extension to 3D. Our bodies are involved. We move our hands, we move our heads, and all good things, which is exactly what we used to do. We used to go into a bank branch and talk to a bank manager, a teller, and cash and check, and so on. Now we don't do that. We just use, a whole variety of apps to do that without any type of interaction. So it's a little bit of dare I say, back to the future in terms of how we're actually going to engage with each other, with service providers or human beings in this space. And I'm actually very excited by that, right? Because it's putting our bodies back into play, the materiality of our existence, back into play in terms of us as a community, as a society, wherever we may live and whatever we may do. And I feel that's an enrichment in terms of human development, and I'm very excited by it. Obviously, the Gremlins and Guardrails to the topic of our talk today, is something that we rely on governments, on regulatory agencies, on industry standards and bodies to provide that framework and safety net, as in Safe 2 Weeks, so that we have trust, authenticity, verifiability, and so on, true authenticity, so that we can engage with each other with confidence and with assurance that we're protected, right? And that although gremlins will come and go and pop up, that our guardrails are sufficient not to stifle development, innovation, creativity, all of the good things that we want out of this, but also have that underpinning and floor so that the proverbial bad actor or bad actors of whatever kind don't mess it up for all the good people. And I think, the call to engagement in that regard across the society, government, civic society, supranational bodies is as prescient now in this new vista of the metaverse as it's ever been over the last several decades.
Yeah, and I think that's really, Damien, keying off of that and Tom, your earlier points, I think history is not just how we do at creating guardrails that protect and really emphasize the legitimate actors and the well-intended and we don't do well at that, right? We tend, when we get to regulation, and this is why I sort of say we need a much more agile environment for that, is that we tend to push the risks of the bad actors onto the good actors through hurdles and requirements and identifying light, stoplights and pictures before you can access your, retail account. So I think we need to, if we want the benefits from this new technology, we need to really turn that on its head and focus more on the bad actors than on taxing the good actors who are just trying to sort of learn here. That's probably a conversation for another time. But it does sort of raise another question we got in the chat too, is what can individuals do? So you're not a corporation that's developing these technologies, but you're being visited with them. I think we'll be talking about that in 3 to 5 years, is how do individuals describe and assert the sorts of conditions of trust that they want to see in order to engage and reveal their data around gaze and preference and all those other things, and sentiment and all those other things. So creating opportunities and conversation, I think that is part of the stakeholder conversation, Damien, you were encouraging. But I think in 3 to 5 years, that's going to be a much more robust conversation, right?
Yeah. In terms of your point about how to promote metaverse safety, I would say follow the things that you should be doing now in Web 2.0, but even more prominently in Web 3.0. For example, cybersecurity hygiene, as they call it. Don't have your passwords be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in the metaverse, for example. There's surveys, it's hilarious, but many people have really, really easy passwords. Use 2-factor authentication. There may be 3-factor authentication in the future with these things, because we need to amplify our safety as we go into these much more immersive environments in which much more data about ourselves could be divulged in ways that we may not necessarily want it to be. So if you're very careful, and I would also urge you, follow the good folks at XR Safety Work, follow the work that's being done by Karen and the Cantellus group, follow Damien and the Molybdenum, follow me in FutureGrasp and so forth, so that you can stay aware of these things overall and you don't get caught unawares. When I was in the government, that was one of my challenges. It's to point out to congressmen, senators, the White House, et cetera, pay attention to these things, because they're going to come back and bite you if we don't. And the metaverse is another whole level beyond what we used to do 5-10 years ago in those instances.
Damien, any parting word? Thank you, Tom, and I couldn't agree more. Damien, any parting words?
Yeah, I think education, read widely, attend webinars, contribute, participate, activate one's voice, because that's the basis of any type of participation. And I think this is something that, the internet kind of fell upon us, initially from the .mil days and in the 40s and 50s, 60s to now what we do every day in our lives, right? Who would have thought, right? Now we can be older, but we can be wiser, right? And I think it just behoves everybody, whether you've got a, whatever your social media platform of choice is, to engage, discuss, participate and contribute, have fun, but be mindful of the risks, and you know, move to a better world for us all. And that's what any technology ultimately, without being utopian about it, ultimately the goal and objective of any technology is to make our lives easier and to increase participation from all sectors and constituents in society, and to solve problems, right? And if we can always think of first principles and back to basics, no matter what type of technology or framework or whatever it is, I think that will keep us safe and sound.
Yes, and as usual, building on everything, I would just say before we depart that it is a little bit of so with that education, also critical thinking, right? Which is that information is going to change very quickly, and we have to get used to that, and we need to sort of start developing standards for how we learn things and what we do with that. And I keep going back to like the Greek myths. I mean, I think we're still human beings, and we still make the same, you know, we're still capable of the same heroics and the same foibles. And there is a little bit, as Damien said, everything old is new again, but yeah, onward. Anyway, thank you guys so much for taking.
Thank you, Karen, for your wonderful moderating, and Damien for your awesome comments. And I can be reached on LinkedIn, and my Twitter handle's at FutureGrasp. So feel free and reach out if you're interested in talking more with myself or my great colleagues here too.
Great, thank you, Karen. Thank you, Tom. Thank you to Matt and Kevan and all the Safety Week team for enabling today's discussion. I look forward to many, many more of insight and articulation. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Week XRSI. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.